Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, may I extend a very warm welcome to the University of Winchester. My name is Janice de Souza, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Education, Health and Social Care. And it's my very, very great pleasure to welcome you here this evening to Stephanie Spencer's professorial lecture. I'm delighted to introduce a colleague and a friend who's been at the heart of this institution for the last 20 years. Stephanie was instrumental in the transformation of this place from a college to a university, and she's an excellent ambassador for the history of education, both within and beyond the institution. Let me tell you a little bit about Stephanie. She was born in London, and in her own words, she had a colourful career before becoming an academic. For those former students of Stephanie's in the audience who she taught about the 1944 Education Act, you'll be unsurprised to learn that she sailed through her 11+ exam, and she went to a girls' day school trust school. GDST is a network of independent schools founded in 1873 by two pioneering women called Maria Gray and Emily Sheriff, who challenged the contemporary view that the function of girls' education was to enable them to gain a good husband. And they set out instead to give opportunities for girls to thrive in the ways that best suited their interests, abilities, and aspirations. No doubt they would be very proud indeed of this particular alumnus. Stephanie did very well in this context and was academically successful in school, but her passion then was drama. She performed in many productions in her school years, and she took the lead role in St. Joan when she was 16. And she wanted to act professionally and considered going to drama school. So Stephanie negotiated with her mother that she could pursue this dream if she also learned to type and cook. So she progressed from A-levels to Winkfield Place in Windsor, where she successfully achieved her cordon bleu diploma. As with everything she does, Stephanie's subsequent culinary career was successful and varied. She worked in the Cordon Bleu School in London, she ran a vegetarian restaurant, and she freelanced teaching specialised cookery in people's own homes. But Stephanie not only didn't intend cooking to be a long-term career, she hadn't really intended it to be a career at all, and she began to think about a change of direction. By this time, she was married to Peter, who I've lost where he is. Hello, Peter. And she embarked on motherhood and a history degree with the Open University at about the same time. And of course, being Stephanie, she embraced both of these developments with commitment and skill. She gained first-class honours in her studies, and Georgie, who I've seen somewhere, is a wonderful young woman with a very successful career in medicine. Stephanie then went on to do an MA at Royal Holloway, London, and her dissertation title was Advice and Ambition in a Girls' Day School, and so by now you should be beginning to get the theme. In this study, Stephanie critically engaged with governors' reports about former students who had confounded the expectation merely to become good wives, although I should clarify, she is a good wife, and were doing much more interesting things in their adult lives that reflected their own skills and interests. Stephanie realised academic work was the thing that she loved doing best, and when she graduated, she became a research assistant with Hilary Land in the School for Social Policy Studies at the University of Bristol. And this is the moment when Stephanie first made contact with this institution. In 1997, during a Women's History Network conference in Brighton, Stephanie just happened to sit down next to Joyce Goodman, who invited Stephanie to give a paper here that very same year. At that time, this institution was in its preparations to become a university, and it was giving out studentships to PhD candidates as part of a strategy for enhancing our research capacity. Stephanie joined us in that first ever batch of PhD students and quickly progressed from this to becoming a valued member of the Education Studies team. At the time, the programme and team were relatively small, but both have expanded since in a dramatic way, and particularly under Stephanie's leadership as head of department for the last 7 years. Stephanie combines a deep commitment to inspiring students' engagement with the history of education with a consuming passion for her field of research. She's written numerous articles, too many for me to mention here, and book chapters, edited special editions, published 3 books, others are in preparation, and it's lovely that several of her co-authors are in the audience today. Stephanie is also an inveterate conference attendee. And in the last year alone, she's presented papers in such varied locations as Chicago, Buenos Aires, and Sheffield. And of course, as president, she will be presiding over the History of Education Society 50th Anniversary Conference, which is being held here in Winchester this weekend. Stephanie, it's been a joy to be your colleague and friend over the past 20 years. And I'm delighted to have the privilege of introducing your inaugural lecture. Stephanie, the stage is all yours. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephanie Spencer.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests. And thank you, Janice. I'm not sure that I can quite live up to the introduction that you've given me, but thank you. I'm going to start this evening with 3 quotes that frame the lecture and have been instrumental in guiding some of the questions that have informed my wider research. The first, I've stolen from Professor Geert Biester, borrowed from Professor Geert Biester at his keynote at the British Education Research Association conference in Brighton this year. And he said, I've prepared quite a lot, so just look out for what speaks to you. So I thought that's a very good start. So you have that. Morwenna Griffiths, a feminist philosopher, uses the metaphor of a web to explain the formation of women's identity. She argues that women draw their strength from the communities of which they're part. These communities, as well as providing support, can also be in tension with competing demands. Now, in the audience tonight, there are friends and colleagues from many aspects of my life. There's my family, my friends from childhood, from my very first OU summer school, members of the Centre for the History of Women's Education, tennis friends, dog training friends, even golf friends, and I don't play golf. Friends and colleagues from here and from the history of education and women's history across the world. I do hope there's something in the following talk that will set you thinking. Thank you for coming. I'm not going to name people by names, but thank you all for coming and being part of a web of friendship that has sustained my many changes of direction and a very satisfying academic career at this institution. So the second quote is from Professor Brian Simon, a historian of education, who observed that education is a site of struggle, but a struggle in terms of equal opportunities, individual struggles, or the struggle for a state to provide the sort of education that will prepare the next generation of citizens. But I've been awarded the title of Professor of History of Women's Education. And so the third quote comes from a comment that was made in one of the interviews from my research into girls' school-leaving experiences in the late 1950s. And it stayed with me over 20 years as an example of how so many women have to negotiate their way between what people expect them to do and to find some form of autonomy in doing what they want to do in their lives. Now, this woman's family had been delighted and so proud that she had passed her 11 plus and gone to grammar school. After taking her O-levels and encouraged by her teachers and by her friends, she decided that she wanted to stay to do her A-levels and to go on to university. So she went home and she asked her father, and he said, it was wonderful, but that's enough. And she left school the next day. Now, we can read that as a story of a girl forced against her will to give up on formal education, leave her friendship group, and abandon the possibility of a successful career. But we should also look at it in the context of its time and the place for the interrelationship between expectations of what women were to do and for the way that women wanted to become the sort of citizens that everybody wanted them to become. Full employment and a family background of minimum school leaving, plus gendered expectations of marriage, family, part-time work, further impacted on girls' school leaving decisions at that stage. So tonight, I'm going to talk about girls' school stories. In fact, I'm going to talk about several sorts of school stories. The ones we read and the ones we tell each other about school and college days. Some of these are fiction, some are recorded as part of oral history projects, some are found in autobiographies. Stories that follow William Cowper's 1772 definition, a story in which native humour reigns is often useful and always entertains. A narrative that may be fact, it may be fiction, or it may be a mixture of both, told for the purpose of illustration or evidence of an event, an emotion, a change in circumstances. It's often told with humour and very often with a kind of self-deprecating wit, or as an illustration of what and why the author of the story sees something is right or wrong thing to do. And so we might claim that stories are in themselves an educational tool. But do these stories matter? They may entertain, but are they useful? And my students who are here will recognise that that is one of the things I am always asking. What will they or can they add either to our knowledge of real education in the past or to any potential impact on policy making in the future? Now, our website states that inaugural lectures provide a platform for new professors to, this is a quote, inform academic colleagues, university staff, students, and the wider community of their current and future research. The University of Bristol, where I began my academic career, as Janice noted, adds, the new professor can celebrate an important personal milestone with family, friends, and colleagues, old and new. Well, it occurred to me that it's only in academia that listening to a lecture at the end of a working day can be seen as a celebration, so thank you. It may, in fact, be the ultimate test of our friendship. The central thread that runs through my reflections on past, present, and future research tonight is that notion of friendship and the significance that sites of education play for the formation of lasting friendships that are as important to our mental well-being as any qualification. Friendship is an apparently neutral term, and it's historically often been presented in a way that is deeply gendered, creating strong bonds amongst groups of boys, amongst groups of men, groups of girls, and groups of women. Over the last 20 years, this university has increasingly stressed the values that drive the institution forwards. Two of these values, the importance of the individual and the aspiration to inclusivity, are central to the formation of friendship, and friendship that provides support, encouragement, and security in both our professional and our personal lives. So it will seem, just to give you a sense, you can chart through this as to where we've got in the lecture. It will make sense to begin by reflecting on the stories of male friendship from the Alumni Voices project that I completed with Andrea Jacobs and Camilla Leach. And these are on sale outside afterwards for anybody who would like to buy one. Prior to 1960, it was an all-male institution, and the importance of male camaraderie was highlighted in interviews from the 1950s and early 1960s. I'm then going to talk about the changing nature of female friendship as presented to readers of British school stories from the late 19th to the mid-20th century. And that's going to be using material from our current project. And in conclusion, I'm going to suggest that future research into the British and international federations of university women can also be framed through ideas of female friendship and sociability. But to return to the problem that I mentioned earlier, do these stories matter? What do they contribute to the history of education? I hope to convince you that history of education does matter. As Janice said, this is something that I care very deeply about. That therefore it should have a place on undergraduate degrees and it should be in school syllabi. That historians of education have an important role to play in advising on policy making for the future, and that individual stories are a valuable part of the historical record of education, both formal and informal. Peter Cunningham, who is here tonight, observed that research in history of education in Britain originated from professional practitioners wanting to find out how the system that they were working in had originated. This weekend, we are delighted to bring the annual International Conference of the History of Education Society to Winchester as we celebrate our 50 years. History of education is flourishing at international and national conferences and in academic journals and well beyond, these days, well beyond teacher education. But is it useful in helping us to understand the current system and to learn from the mistakes of the past? In order to understand whether policies were effective, we need to know more about the experiences of teachers and pupils inside the classroom. These days, we examine the emotions of schooling and the experience of the informal as well as the formal curriculum. As we all know from our own school days, what goes on in the playground and outside the formal classroom is really as formative in our education as any of the exams and the textbooks that we read. History of education is not, absolutely not, about acts and facts. So I'm going to give you a couple of questions to think about. Does it matter that and my students will be able to repeat this with me because I'm always asking them this. Does it matter that our current teachers know little or nothing about the history of education policy and practice? Does it matter that history of education isn't taught as a matter of course in schools? And there's a couple of possible responses. Yes, it does matter. If no one ever knows it was any different, then they won't challenge it. They're just as likely to go along with what's on offer. No, it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant whether something worked in the past or not. The context is different. We can't be shackled by nostalgia. And just because something didn't work in the context of 1950, there's no saying that it won't work now. I leave it to you to make that decision. So now I want to think about friendship and the history of friendship. Barbara Caine observed that friendship is seen as an indication of social integration and a requirement of both physical and mental health, as well as a source of happiness. And as we know, in this year of mental health awareness, the role of schools and colleges in ensuring student well-being should be central to our work. A green paper on children and young people's mental health is due out at the end of this year, and I hope that some attention is paid to the history of this in schools. Perhaps this is one of the sites of struggle. Now, although the word friendship is familiar, the definition is complex. And I'd like to say thank you to Emile for introducing me to Maurice Blanchot, who begins his essay for friendship. There is no such thing as friendship at first sight, rather a gradual occurrence, a slow process through time. We were friends and we hadn't realized. Friendship's key traits are faithfulness, constancy, endurance, perhaps permanence. But the history of friendship highlights changing understandings of the term. It hasn't been the same. It's been around for 2,500 years, from classical Athens. Aristotle identified different types of friendship, but virtue friendship was the rarest and the most valuable. Such relationship could only be built between virtuous people. And of course, by virtuous people, he meant men. While the traits of friendship may remain constant, the gendering of friendship has changed dramatically. By the end of the 19th and 20th century, it was female friendship that was seen as most significant, most genuine, and most enduring. Friendship also involves negotiating conflicting ethical, social, or familial demands. But if we follow Griffiths' idea of the web of identity, then friendship groups that provide the context for learning who we are or becoming the person that we want to be are now especially important for women and girls. Now, much of the literature on friendship assumes that this is a relationship between adults, and yet we have to learn that, so it must be as children, and therefore in school, that the learning process takes place. And relationship education, that much talked about thing, is not the same, because relationship education might be imposed on children, and friendship is something that is created by children and evolves between children. They have to learn how to make friends, keep friends, and to recognise deep friendship that will endure into adult life. Some of you should be able to read the little ditty on friendship that comes from Schoolgirl's Own. One verse that talks about the energetic girl and one about the friendly girl. A genuine person to have in any classroom. So I want to talk to you about stories of education that are also stories of friendship. They demonstrate how the performance of friendship also reflects performances of masculinity and femininity. First of all, alumni voices. In 2015, we published Alumni Voices. It's a record of 50 years of the voices of the people who worked and graduated from this institution. Our oldest interviewee was a student who was here before World War II, and we also interviewed his son, who was here post-World War II. And the most recent were graduates in the 2000s. When we came to analyse the stories and to pick out the themes, it was friendship that kept coming up as the most significant thing that people remembered about their time here. It was the lifelong friendships that were seen as highly significant in their professional lives. We were constantly told it was a small institution, it was friendly, we all looked after each other. And they called it a small institution from when it was 250 people in 1950 to when it was over 5,000 people in 2000. Some of you might recognise this site of friendship, King Alfred Student Union, round about 65. Don't you just love the hairstyles? Friendship is still one of the most significant things that is mentioned in our student surveys today, and it's something that we see as very important. But why is it so important? After all, the purpose of an institution should be to send people out with the qualifications for their careers. But with so many technological advances now, we see less and less of our students. They can send in their essays electronically, we mark them electronically, we hand them back electronically. We live further away, so we spend less time, both staff and students, we spend less time on campus. The students have to work to pay their way through college, and so they also spend less time on campus. So it is really important that the investment that we make in the social spaces when they are on campus should be one of the major things in terms of our investment. So my first story is from Alumni Voices. One alumni weekend, we were on campus to film some interviews with those who were celebrating 40 years since they'd left. It was the hottest weekend of the year, and it was a real testament to the people who came and sat under those lights for 20 minutes that they thought that their voices should be part of the institution's history. They were a radical lot in the 1950s and 60s, and their youthful exuberance had got them into trouble. Current students don't listen to this bit. Several men told the story of how they had carved out a symbol on the hill opposite the university. This was a vivid memory, but for some of them told us it was a question mark, and some of them told us it was a hammer and sickle. Perhaps they revised the details in order to distance themselves from their youthful politics. Perhaps they didn't really know what it was they were carving out. But what was important was that they told the story, nevertheless, at the distance of 40 years, because it showed group activity. Another story was developed at more length. A group of them painted King Alfred's statue red. The next day, a policeman called at the college and demanded to see the perpetrator. After some consultation, the whole student body stepped forward. And because they all took responsibility, they were let off with a caution. They did have to clean the statue. The whole event varied in the details, but we were told this story over and over and over again as an example of friendship. Now, on to the current research for the fictional genre of the girls' school story. I'm sure some of you have read The Chalet School. The widely recognised genre of the school story was reflected in the popularity of the West End comedy Daisy Pulls It Off. This parody of the girls' boarding school story by Denise Dugan ran for about 1,000 performances. And so loads of people would not have been to university. They didn't know anybody who'd been to, didn't know anyone who'd been to boarding school. They hadn't been to boarding school themselves, but they understood the genre of that school novel. The girls' school story, as we might recognise it today, became popular with L.T. Mead at the end of the 19th century. It was developed by Angela Brazel, which was how she wanted it pronounced, at the beginning of the 1900s, and then reached a peak in the 1920s to 50s with stories by Eleanor Brent Dyer, The Chalet School, Elsie Oxenham, The Abbey School, and Dorita Fairley-Bruce, The Dimsey and Springdale stories. Enid Blyton's Mallory Towers, which might be a more familiar one to some of you, was a little bit later, but it remained popular into the 1960s. The genre also emerged at the same time in the US, and on our current project, we are arguing that in a different social and political and cultural context, similar ideas in the school story were promoted to girls as to how they should be learning to perform their middle-class femininity. We argue that the American heroine, Marjorie Dean, would have had instant rapport with Dimsey had they met on a cross-channel steamer, or on a cross-Atlantic steamer. But tonight, my focus is on the British stories, and to hear more about the American ones, you're going to have to buy the book next year. The full-length girls' school novels, often given as gifts between friends and by older relatives, were also available in public libraries. Additionally, the appetite for school stories was fed by weekly comics and annuals such as School Friends, so it was they were widely accessible. I've included some pictures of the covers from the cheaper publications to demonstrate the all-pervasiveness and the familiarity of these images. As I move to some examples of friendship in the school stories, please keep in mind the question as to why these stories were so popular, and therefore the role that they played in informal education. After all, they weren't the literary standard to be set as set books. It was an entirely free choice of reading, and as we can see, they were also given sometimes as prizes. There's much research into the significance of teenage reading. Graham Greene reflected that it's only in childhood that books have any deep influence in our lives. In later life, we admire, we're entertained, and we may modify some views we already hold, but we're more likely to hold in books merely a confirmation of what is in our minds already. And W.E. Johns, the author of the Biggles and Worrells stories, was quite upfront about it when he observed, "I give boys what they want, not what their elders and betters think they ought to read. I teach at the same time under camouflage." Certainly, the authors of the school stories expected their readers to regard their characters as friends. Eleanor Brent Dyer went so far as to edit a Friends of the Chalet School newsletter, which by 1963 had 4,000 members. Angela Brazel's autobiography, My Own School Days, was written for her readers, and Dorita Fairley-Bruce's dedications included her close friendship with her readers. I noted earlier changing attitudes to the potential for genuine female friendship by the end of the 19th century. And in the following examples, we can see how the school story for girls offers us an insight into some of the concerns that worried girls about friendship, about the emotional displays of friendship at the end of the 19th century. So, more pictures for you to look at. L.T. Mead wrote A Sweet Girl Graduate in 1891. And her story of Prissy begins when Aunt Raby sends Priscilla off to college. She says, "You're a clever girl, Prissy. I don't hold with the present craze about women's education, but I feel somehow that I shall be proud of you. You'll be learned enough, but you'll be a woman with it all." The message is clear to the reader. If you're going to college, you have got to retain your femininity. Prissy's first experience of St. Benet's makes very uncomfortable reading. I don't recommend reading this book, to be honest, as she inadvertently comes in the wrong door to dinner. She sits at the wrong table. She feels that she doesn't fit in, and so therefore she does not make any friends. The most popular girl, Maggie, sets out something I think we may all recognise from our own school days. She was the person who appeared suddenly to take someone up and be really friendly with them. And Maggie is upbraided by the thoughtful Nancy. Maggie, you know you'll take up that miserable fresher for about a fortnight and make her imagine that you're going to be excellent friends for the rest of your life, and then you'll just snuff her out as if she'd never existed. I know you, Maggie, and I call it cruel. Although Prissy's come to college to qualify herself to look after her, of course, orphaned siblings, she does keep herself from the other girls, and that makes for loneliness and unhappiness. She overhears a conversation the first night between Maggie and Nancy that demonstrates the rather florid vocabulary of love that warns readers of the pitfalls of superficial displays of emotion and devotion. "Oh, I wouldn't be jealous if I were you, Nancy," said Maggie's lazy, sweet voice. "The poor girl is as odd as her name, but it gives me a kind of aesthetic pleasure to be good to people. You have no cause to be jealous, sweet pet." And then there was the sound of one girl kissing another. "The unfortunate girl's fallen in love with you. There's no doubt about that, Maggie," said Nancy. "Well, my dear, she'll get over that little fever presently. When I'm kind to them, they all have it. I believe I'm gracious to them just because I like to see that grateful, affectionate expression in their eyes. The fact is, Nance, I have a perfectly crazy desire to excite love." "But do you give love, Maggie? Do you ever give it back in return?" "Sometimes, I don't know. I believe I'm rather fond of you, for instance." So the plot line of Sweet Girl Graduate, read at the distance of over a century, is very clearly didactic, and it gives us an insight into the performance of friendship in the very early days of girls' independence from home. Love and friendship are conflated in ways that they're not as we move later into the decades. Changes in the air. Prissy's moral force is a force for good. Here she is, showing that her trunk is empty. She doesn't have anything to decorate her plain, austere room. And the book ends with L.T. Mead saying, "Women like Priscilla live at the root of the true life of a worthy nation. Maggie Oliphant had brilliance, beauty, wealth. She also had strong personal influence and the power of creating love wherever she went. But when Priscilla Peel leaves St. Benet's, she will be more missed than was Maggie." In addition to detailing the life of a college girl, L.T. Mead's exploration of female friendship demonstrates the nature and perhaps concerns over female friendship in the new girls' schools. Girls were beginning to leave home. Women teachers were beginning to show that this was actually quite a good career to take up and not something that you did as a default option. So now I'm going to move forwards to the 1920s and the Dimsey stories. I can hear that they're familiar to some people. By the 1920s, the world of the boarding school for girls was more familiar to the general public, even though most readers were still leaving school at 14 or 15. But the vicissitudes of young friendship may well have been familiar to all readers. Authors began to create series of books that took the heroine from her first days as an enthusiastic, slightly wavered but very honest young girl in the third form, right the way up through school and usually into married life. The Dimsey series by Dorita Fairley Bruce, written between 1921 and 1941, does just that. Begins with Dimsey in the third form, and the last one we see her solving a wartime spy drama up in Scotland. By now, the heroine's worthy characteristics are immediately recognised, and they serve to make her instantly popular, so they're much more fun to read than those sort of rather dire, dark days of L.T. Mead and poor old Prissy. In the second book in the series, Dimsey moves up. The true friends, Pam, Jean, Dimsey, Rosamond and Erica, form a league designed to stop the less desirable manifestations of the schoolgirl's crush, as manifested in the vocabulary of L.T. Mead. The anti-soppists set out their rules. No one is to give flowers to teachers or seniors. You are not to sleep with one of their hair ribbons under your pillow. You are not to kiss anyone unless you're absolutely obliged to do so. Now, there follows after this a very heated debate as to whether kissing a dog is soppy. And what they decide is that it's not soppy if you kiss your own dog, but it is a bit soppy if you kiss somebody else's. But soon it looks as if they might be sidetracked from their higher aspirations. Rosamond is lured into friendship with Nita Tomlinson, the bad girl of the series. Rosamond isn't an auntie now, she's a feeble sophist, as bad as Winnie Hatton and worse than Betty Gray. Worse than anybody in the whole school, amended Pamela. Who ever heard of anyone being gone on Nita Tomlinson? But it isn't fair, cried Dimsey desperately. Ros hasn't broken any of the rules. No, but she has fielded a senior's tennis balls and she's weeded her garden. Readers will be clear that it's motives as well as actions that define healthy friendship. By the time Dimsey moves up again, she's well established as a friend to half the school. And this generates a discussion on friendship and the amount of friends that an individual girl can genuinely have. Dimsey observes, "It sounds as though I cared a little for a lot of people and not much for anyone. Rather shallow, don't you think?" Erica replies, "But if a girl has just one chum to whom she's devoted, they generally become absorbed in each other, and they aren't much good to the rest of the community." Dimsey, it was noted, had 5 special friends, and that group of 5 seems to go through many of the books in this genre. Erica concludes, "I'm far from complaining of Dimsey as a chum, but since she thinks I am, I may just mention that 5 friends are really as much as any girl has time for in school, where we work as hard as we do at Jane's. So those of you who are here, just the 5 friends, please, because we want you to work hard." Fairly Bruce reprises the anti-sophists when the girls reach the 6th form. They're most concerned that Jean's poetry writing is soppy. And by now the friendship group is firmly established as the 6 inseparables. Dimsey negotiates a way round the problem by declaring that Jean's poetry is actually quite good, and therefore it's not soppy. The poem's entitled is called The Old School, and I'm going to let you read just 2 verses of it to decide whether it's soppy. I really need a violin as well, don't I? The poem is declared ripping, and all is well, but the self-policing of inappropriate sentiment is clear. Central to the genre of the girls' school story is misunderstood motives that undermine true friendship, and so the reader learns that she must never, never misunderstand her friend. Jean's poetry writing undermines the work that she's doing and the responsibilities that she's taking on as head girl. And Dimsey, being a strong friend to the school, is very upset about this, and it causes a tension in their friendship. But at the end, true friendship is restored when Jean recognises that Dimsey saved her poetry from the fire. "Dimsey," Jean cried, "you've saved my verses. That's how you got your hand burnt. I see it plainly now. And the worst of it is that you went and did it before I had a chance to tell you what a jealous, huffy beast I've been." As they embrace for a second or 2, Dimsey shakes herself free. "Jean," she said sternly, "do let's at least try to remember that we're anti-sophists." So now to move to the Chalet School. In the Chalet series by Eleanor Brent Dyer, the problem of all-consuming friendship provides one of the main themes of the books that go through from the 1920s right up to the 1960s. Many of the Chalet books feature the arrival of a girl who doesn't fit in because she's been educated at home and she doesn't understand this whole thing about what true friends do, such as Lavender Laughs and the Chalet School and Eustacia. The first book explains why Madge Bettany takes her younger sister, Jo, aged 12, to the Tyrol to start a school. It also introduces the main characters who rapidly form the friendship group, and that group continues through the school into adulthood. Jo takes centre stage. She's at first described as reading too much and not having enough company of her own age. She's in need of companionship. Grizzle Cochrane, 14 and a half, another lonely soul with a hated stepmother. There's a lot of hated stepmothers in these books. You either hate your stepmother or you're an orphan. Take your pick. The third new arrival at the school is Simone Lecoutier, a cousin of the French Mademoiselle, who was the Bettany's governess. In bringing in a range of nationalities, Brent Dyer exploits stereotypes in order to promote a universal girlhood for whom learning how to live together and live an ethical and virtuous life is more important than the formal lessons. Jo and Grizel's friendship develops quickly, but when Simone arrives, she was very shy and quiet and apt to be shocked by the tomboyishness of her companions. As the girls start to get to know each other, they discuss how the school will develop, and the new pupils make it clear that their knowledge of English schools comes from school stories, so there's a nice bit of intertextuality going on. At this point, Brent Dyer puts in a clear warning to her readers that her series is different. I understand, though most of you are very honourable, it's not always so, said Gertrude. Jo replies, what do you mean? English girls always play the game. But some cheat and look at examination papers beforehand and take what is not their own, returned Gertrude. Tosh, I've never met any, declares Jo. But it says so in the books I've read, persisted the older girl. Oh, that's only to make the story, explained Jo. We don't really do such things. So the reader's led to believe that this is a different sort of school story and therefore they can really learn from the events that unfold in the pages. Madge says to Jo, because she's worried about Simone, I hope you don't go off and leave her alone. And Jo says, well, we haul her along whenever we can, when we can find her. Now, the problem is that Simone runs away. And Jo finds her, and Simone admits that she's lonely because she's jealous of the friendship between Jo and Grizel. So Jo says that's absolutely fine, we can all be pals. You, me, and Grizel. But pally is not what Simone wants. For truth to tell, she'd conceived a violent affection for Jo, and Grizel, with her vivid prettiness, repelled her. Simone says she wants Jo to be her amie intime. Grizel makes friends with everyone. I don't want her. I want only you. I love you. Anyone less sentimental than Joey Bettany, it would have been hard to find. And now she sat rigid with horror while Simone made this little speech. But Jo, of course, is soft-hearted and she realises that she has to make an effort. So she says, right ho, we'll be pals. And now do mop up. There's a gem. Simone sets out the parameters for the amie intime. You will relate to me all your secrets and walk with me and love me. Yes, just so long as it doesn't interfere with other people, responds Joey. Then Simone says, and now, Joey, please kiss me. You've never kissed me yet. Joey hastily brushed Simone's cheek with her lips and then said, I don't kiss anyone very much. You mustn't go feeling hurt because I don't kiss you every day. We don't in England. In this short interchange, which, as you can imagine, leads to further problems when Jo just doesn't perform the sort of friendship that Simone wants, the reader is left in no doubt how an English girl would indicate her affection for her school chum. Simone remained glued to her side all afternoon when it was beginning to dawn on Joey that she might have undertaken a friendship which was to prove rather tiresome on occasions. We can read the fictional school stories as informal instructions to readers how to perform a friendship that is ethical and virtuous, but also very much a friendship rooted in changing constructions of femininity, driven by cultural, social and economic change in the wider community. From the very elaborate and tactile performance of friendships in LT Mead through to the more prosaic and public displays of camaraderie that resonate more with the hijinks of the King Alfred's alumni, there are moments of insight in the fictions that resonate with everyday life. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we had a book reading group with the Winchester Women Graduates for the Sybil Campbell Reading Group. And we read Dora Russell's Tamarisk Tree. Now, Dora Russell was the second wife of Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, and she was a feminist campaigner. She also happened to be an old girl of my school. And she reflected in her autobiography. Now, you have to remember that Dimsey was written in 1920 about the anti-sophists, and Dora Russell was at school in the 1910s. And she wrote, like the schools in the storybooks, we had a head girl in the sixth form who was adored by all. She was tall and fair and willowy, her flaxen plaits wreathed about her head. We would lie in wait for her on the way to school, hoping to carry her satchel and enjoy a few words of conversation. There would be rivalries and misunderstandings, skillfully contrived to bring about little private reconciliations that meant so much. We've got L.T. Mead going on all over again. Came the day, however, when some of us reached the conclusion that all this sentimentality was bad for the school. Molly, the hockey captain, grey-eyed, broad of face with a generous laughing mouth, was one of my friends, and together we concocted a plan for a secret society. And this secret society was called the League of the Torn Rubber Band, and its members pinned a piece of torn rubber band to their blouse or to their dress. And it signified that the member was pledged to break the bonds of sentimental attachments and treat everyone in a normal, friendly way. So just some concluding remarks on my future plans. The completion of the School Stories research is scheduled for August 2018. And as ever, new projects are evolving. The theme of friendship is already proving powerful in the early days of work on the British and International Federations of University Women. My recent article on the British Federation observed how, like friendship, sociability can be both welcoming and excluding. In searching through the minutes of the Hospitality Committee, it's apparent that the promotion of international friendship was seen as a way to also promote peace and understanding between women of different nations, and so that they could participate in a whole range of networks of women's organisations. I'm particularly interested in exploring the activities at grassroots level, looking at the role that local organisations played in both offering a space for developing the skills that were gained at college and university and for the enactment of public friendship. The symbol of the Graduate Women International, the lamp of friendship today, highlights the importance of the wider significance of the aspiration to be friends. And so what we have here is the lamp of friendship. Then on the black and white ladies on the top of on the right-hand side are a group of the International Federation of Women at conference in London in the 1950s. At the bottom is the Centre for the History of Women's Education seminar and the Sybil Campbell seminar. You may recognise a few faces, as well as Zainab Husseini, who is an Afghani postgraduate who is being funded at Chester by the by the British Federation of University Women. And on the right, you may recognise one of those people with my group of 4 chums. The 5th one's taking the photograph, of course. Friends, chums, pals, family and colleagues, if I may, I will remind you of the points I made at the beginning, that in searching for the details of educational experience, we need to look at a range of evidence in order to recognise the significance of real or fictional school and college in the evolution of friendship. The stories confirm the need for time and space in schools and colleges to develop the skills of getting along together, of developing deep but not exclusive friendships. At the same time, they've shown that the term itself and the way that we perform friendship is historically gendered and produced as well throughout history. In short, history of education does matter, and the search for details builds into a more composite picture of the past, which enriches our knowledge and enables us to move forwards. A 2015 survey put England 14th out of 15th in children's happiness, with widespread bullying being a major factor. The stories of L.T. Mead, Dorita Fairley-Bruce and Eleanor Brent Dyer all have as a central theme both the potential for good in true friendship and the toxic nature of false friendship. And this suggests that the problem is not new, and perhaps that there were some readers that read in these books ways to negotiate their way round the formation of true friendship and to recognise some of the Nita Tomlinsons of this world. So in reflecting on the 3 quotes that I offered at the beginning, see if you can remember them. I hope you have found something, complete blank. I hope you did find something to speak to you. Brian Simon, located the struggle for education within social class. And when we examine individual stories, we can see that the struggle is also about working out what is right and who we are within the security of friendships that evolve as a gradual occurrence, a slow process through time. And finally, whether or not you thought it was wonderful, it's certainly enough. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, and Stephanie. So it's my great pleasure, Stephanie, to thank you for your inaugural professorial lecture this evening. I'm Joyce Goodman. I'm the Professor of History of Education here at the University of Winchester and a colleague of Stephanie's in the Centre for the History of Women's Education. Now, as Stephanie mentioned, the university's website refers to an inaugural lecture as a platform for new professors to talk about their current and future research. And we heard a lot this evening about friendship, about sociability, and about the stories we read and the ones we tell to each other about our school and college days. Now, Stephanie did what professors do. She professed. And she did so in both an engaging and a serious way. And I have to tell you, Stephanie, your dramatic aspirations were put to really good use this evening. So that for us, as a result, attending a lecture at the end of a busy day was indeed a celebration. So thank you. Now, becoming a professor is a recognition of a myriad acts of professing that make up an academic career. But professing does not follow the neat career trajectories and that acts of recognition in the ladder of academic careers suggest. Professing is much more like an ongoing intellectual web, and Stephanie talked about a web, webs of identity, and there are webs of intellectual identity as well. So in these webs, lines thread and they knot together through the tensions, the frictions, and the joys of creating and then disseminating the fresh academic work that professorial recognition highlights. Professors profess in lots of different ways. Professors profess in print. They profess in public debate. They profess in teaching. They profess through networking. And the lines that thread together in Stephanie's intellectual professing are many and various. And there are far too many, Stephanie, for me to outline all of them here. But I do want to just pick on a few highlights because they demonstrate Stephanie's intellectual professing throughout her academic career. Now, the dictionary notes that the ancient meaning of the word career is at full speed. I rather like the idea of going careering, and Stephanie has definitely gone at full speed. We can see that from her publication record. Even at the start of her master's dissertation, part of that dissertation was published as an academic article in a journal that's now in the Social Science Citation Index. She was awarded the prize for the best paper by a new researcher at the International Standing Conference for the History of Education. No mean feat. Her PhD thesis, published by Palgrave as Gender Work in Education in Britain in the 1950s, and I think there are copies outside you can buy, was very well reviewed in academic circles. A reviewer who's actually here tonight noted that its rich mosaic of evidence gives the reader a deep understanding of how females were educated during the 1950s into how to be feminine, how to be a woman in post-war society, but also how women were not passive consumers of such messages. This rich mosaic of evidence included girls' career novels and women's magazines. So while people in the British Library were reading ancient works, Stephanie sat there giggling over girls' career novels. Her book then, of course, crossed academic and popular thresholds in ways that characterised Stephanie's intellectual signature. as we've heard tonight. For example, her book from her PhD thesis was listed in The Guardian's Best Books on 1950s Women, and it was cited fourth in their list. And similarly, Alumni Voices, The Changing Experience of Higher Education, which Stephanie wrote with Andrea Jacobs and Camilla Leach, and from which, thank you Stephanie for the hijinks tonight, explored new ways of writing histories of higher education. And Stephanie's most recent book, Women in 50s Britain, edited with Claire Langhammer and published by Routledge this year, comes from the very successful ESRC seminar series on women in the 1950s that Stephanie convened with Professors Tinkler and Langhammer from Manchester and Sussex universities. And yes, we are really looking forward to the new book on school stories, and I'm sure you sold a lot of copies in advance tonight. But running alongside Stephanie's books are also Stephanie's thread of special issues for highly rated journals that make up her intellectual web. I counted 5 in total. The special issue she edited for the Journal of Education Administration and History built around Joan Scott's leading article for the American Historical Review on gender as a useful category of historical analysis. And Joan Scott is a very eminent historian, and that special issue elicited a very positive response from Joan Scott herself. And there are special issues of Women's History Review, of History of Education, and a special history of Women's Review with Dr. Nicola Phillips from the Royal Holloway College, University of London, who's here tonight. The special issue of History of Education with Professor Tim Allender from the University of Sydney resulted from Stephanie's networking with the Australian and New Zealand History of Education Society, to whom she delivered a keynote address in New Zealand. So Stephanie does a lot of travelling and presenting all over the place. Now, Stephanie's professing in print connects with her networking through board memberships, the Journal of Education Administration and History, History of Education, and Women's History Review, and through committee memberships, the British Federation of University Women's Grants Committee, Women's History Network, and the History of Education, where Stephanie is currently president. And just as Stephanie's professing in print crosses academic and popular boundaries, so does her professing in person, on radio, on TV, and as an invited speaker to women's groups and at girls' schools. And as we heard tonight, that's something that Stephanie excels at with humour. Students too attest to her professing as an inspiring teacher, and colleagues to the collegiality she brought to her role as head of department and continues to bring to her leadership of the Centre for the History of Women's Education. Now, at a time when political agendas seek to employ education as a means to the end of employability rather than as an end in itself, these acts of professing are important threads in the duties of the professor who is a historian of education. Writing about the duties of the historian of education, Richard Aldrich notes that each moment in the historical past was formerly both a future and a present. And Aldrich cites the historian's mantra that today is the tomorrow that historians worried about yesterday. Now, Stephanie talked about her plans for research on the British Federation of University Women, and she's written extensively, and as we heard tonight, about the importance of friendship and of sociability, and it's a significant part of women's entry into public space, into political and economic activity, and in their development of active citizenship at home and abroad. But her writing also highlights the tensions between the desire to live amongst others and yet retain individuality, and how sociability is far more complex than simply reciprocal hospitality, for it demonstrates the fragile nature of human relations. And Stephanie talked about the stories we read and the ones we tell each other about our school and college days. Stories that, as she says, have to be set against changing social, cultural, and political contexts. But as she writes elsewhere, school stories do not just reflect a nostalgic utopian past. After all, the legacy of the closed school community that's made series such as Harry Potter so successful with the current generation points to the importance of the imaginary as a way into articulating aspirations for the future, understanding the present, and recognising the role of the past. And in working to recognise the role of the past, in understanding the present, and articulating aspirations for the future, historians of women's education and of women's lives, like Stephanie, have an important role in a world where the fragility of human nature and of the world itself is at risk as never before. So I therefore ask you to join me in thanking Stephanie very much for her inaugural professorial lecture this evening. Thank you, Stephanie.